Okay, in this particular lesson, we're going to be looking at two different parts of your textbook, or two different sections of your textbook, specifically 2.9, which is specialized cells, as well as 3.1, which is hierarchy of structure in animals. I find that these two lessons are very, very related, so it just makes sense to present them together. So let's get into the organization of a living animal. Right? So chapter 2 was all about cells. In chapter 3, we're going to be looking at different animals and how we have organs and organ systems and tissues and all of these different things that come together to make one organism. So in this chapter, or as we're moving into chapter 3, what we're going to be doing is sort of zooming out, if you will, to see the bigger picture of one living animal organism. Right? So life comes in different range of sizes, so you can have single-celled organism or you can have multi-celled organisms. Just think back to one of our previous lessons. What are those two different types of classifications called? So if you have a single-celled organisms that's more simple, what do we call that? And what do we call a multi-celled organism that's a little bit more complex? I'm going to give you a second to think about it. If you have an answer, I'm going to tell it to you in 3, 2, 1. So the single-celled, more simple organism was what we called a prokaryote, and a multi-celled organism that's a little bit more complicated was what we called a eukaryote. So hopefully you remember that. But essentially, we're going to be looking at eukaryotic organisms, specifically those that have several different types of cells that work together to have one living organism. Okay, so there is a classification of levels of organization. So we start off in the most simple thing, and then we end up in the most complicated thing, right? So we start off, each smallest fundamental living thing part of an animal is what we call a cell, right? So specifically a specialized cell. So that refers to a skin cell or a blood cell or any different type of cell in your body, a muscle cell, a nerve cell. All of those can be categorized as a special cell. When you have a bunch of specialized cells together, you form a tissue, right? You might have heard the term muscle tissue or epithelial tissue. All of those are referring to a bunch of different specialized cells put together. Then when you have a bunch of different tissues put together, you get an organ. When you have a bunch of different organs together, you get an organ system. When you have a bunch of different organ systems together, you get an organism. So in today's lesson, we're going to be exploring each level of this classification, starting at specialized cells, and then working our way up towards organ system. Okay. As for our example, so on your note package, you're going to see that there's some blanks that you can fill in with an example of it. I'm going to go back to this slide right here, and I'm going to let you copy down the examples given here. So in the level of a specialized cell, the example that you can think of is a heart muscle cell, right? So any specialized cell. So our heart cell is specialized to do its duty within the heart. And when you have a bunch of these heart muscle cells put together, you get heart muscle tissue. And then when you put a whole bunch of heart muscle tissues together, you get a heart, which is the organ. And then when you have the heart working with other organs together, you get the circulatory system. That's our organ system. And then you've got that organ system working with other organ systems like the digestive system and the nervous system. You get the full organism, right? So it's just a breakdown of all of the living parts that there are in our bodies. Yep. Okay, so just make sure you have that example down there in your notes. So let's start off with specialized cells. Those are a very basic component. So cell specialization refers to the fact that different types of cells in our bodies have different structures and then they have different functions. They have different structures so that they can perform their different unique functions. So you have that chart in your notes. I want you to fill in these as you go. You might have to pause. I'm going to be talking through these. You might have to pause the screen and then just write it down. So the first type of specialized cells that we're going to be looking at is the muscle cell. And in terms of the structure and function, muscle cells are arranged in bundles, right? They're called muscle fibers. These cells can contract, they can shorten and expand, right? So that's why when you flex your muscles, you can see that movement, right? So muscle cells can contract, which makes these fibers shorter, and then that causes the bones to move, right? So the whole idea of movement, our muscle cells have to facilitate movement in our bodies, which is why it's made up of these fibers. So it's a key theme that you're going to find throughout cells and even tissues is that the function of these particular cells are based off of the structure of it, right? The structure and function of these are very closely related. Moving on from muscle cells, we've got nerve cells. So these are cells that are long and thin, and they have lots of different branches. And nerve cells are how our brain sends us signals throughout the rest of our body. They conduct electrical impulses to control body activity in any part of our body, right? That could be our hands or our legs or our lungs or our ears or eyes. All of these have nerve cells connecting all the way back to our brain, right? They have to be long and thin so that they can send these impulses very, very quickly. Moving on to red blood cells. So these are the cells that make up our blood. They contain hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is a protein that holds on or hangs on to oxygen, right? So when we breathe in oxygen into our lungs, that oxygen is then transferred to our blood, and that takes that oxygen to different parts of our body. These cells are smooth, so they can easily pass through the blood vessels. Their shape it's sort of like a little cave, if you will. It's that structure is specifically for hemoglobin so that it can bind to the oxygen very specifically. Moving on to bone cells, right? So bone cells collect calcium, and they have other minerals in there as well, and they allow for these bones to grow. Okay, they build up the bone around themselves, and this creates the body skeleton. There are things like calcium in our bones to give it strength, right? So our skeleton is very, very strong because it has all of these minerals in them. And then we've got skin cells. So skin cells are in layers, and they fit together tightly, and they cover the outside of our body, basically for the reason of protection and to reduce water loss as well, right? So we have to be hydrated. Our epithelial layer, or our skin layer, allows for that water in our bodies to stay within them. And that's it for specialized cells. So we've looked at skin cells, bone cells, red blood cells, nerve cells, and what was our first cells that we looked at? I forgot. Muscle cells, right? So all of these are the specialized cells that we're going to need to know for grade 10. Muscle, nerve, red blood cells, bone cells, and skin cells. Now moving on to tissue. So like I said earlier, a tissue is a group of specialized cells working together, right? There are 4 main tissue types that we're going to be looking at: muscle, epithelial, connective, and nervous. And just like earlier, you might have to pause this video and then just copy down the different parts of it. Okay, so we're going to first look at muscle tissue. So the only parts that I'm going to need you to really write down are the description and the function here. And that goes for all of the different tissue types as well. So muscle tissue are long cells called muscle fibers. Remember, we learned about muscle fibers just previously. And these tissue, when all of these muscle fibers come together, they have these proteins that again facilitate the shortening and the contracting, which helps with movement, right? So our description is the fact that it's made up of muscle fibers and it allows for shortening and contracting. The whole function of this is movement, right? That's what our muscles do. There are different types of muscles. I'm just going to talk through the examples as well. There are muscles that make our bones move. There are muscles that make our digestive or line our digestive tract. And there's muscles in our heart as well. And when we get into the different organ systems, perhaps next week, we'll look at the different details of those. For now, just focus on the description and the function of each tissue type. The next tissue type that we're going to look at is epithelial tissue. And epithelial is a word that you might come across a lot in biology. It just means outer layer. And that's an easy way for you to think about it, because epithelial talks about our skin. A description of it, it's very thin sheets, tightly packed. It covers surfaces of both internal organs, and it's found on our outside as well. The function of it, it protects from dehydration, and it allows for us to have our organs move in a low friction way. Examples of these: skin, right, on our very, very outside, and then also lining of our digestive system. Moving on to our third type of tissue, we've got connective tissue. So these are different types of cells that hold together different organs, systems, etc. So you might have our muscles and our bones, right? Those two come into contact. There's connective tissue in between that to help support those two different parts or organs coming together. The main function of the connective tissue is support and insulation. Examples of these: bones, tendons, blood, all of these are connective tissue. Nerve tissue is our next type of tissue. They're long, thin cells with fine branches, and they allow for electrical impulses to pass through them. The main function is communication, sensory, coordination, all of those things that our nervous system does. Okay, so those are our four main types of tissues. We had epithelial, we had muscle, we had nerve, and we had connective as well. Moving on to organs. Organs are different tissues working together to perform a very specific task. Examples include heart, lungs, stomach, all of those things. We have got several different organs as part of our body. We're going to be learning through those as we learn about the different organ systems. So organ systems are different organs put together. There is a list of different organ systems in your note package. You don't have to know a lot of the information of these. You have to know the names, I would say, right? So the circulatory system, digestive system, respiratory, all of those. There's a few that we'll be focusing on over the next 2 weeks, I guess. So circulatory, digestive, we'll learn respiratory, we'll learn musculoskeletal system, and the nervous system. Right, so there's a lot of systems that we're going to be learning about, a few in a lot more detail. So we're going to be learning circulatory, digestive, and respiratory in a lot of detail, and the others in less detail. But it is good for us to know always. Okay, because those were two different sections of the textbook, you've got two different pages on which you have homework. Okay, that's pretty much it. Bye.